It is the 5th of November 1940, and at a rambling Victorian manor called the Frythe, tucked behind a screen of beech trees just outside Welwyn Garden City, a man in a tweed jacket is kneeling on the lawn beside what looks like an ordinary lump of coal. He glances at his watch, sets the object down among a pile of real coal beside a potting shed, and walks briskly away, counting under his breath. 20 seconds later, the lump of coal detonates with a flat, cracking bang that sends soot and splinters across the grass. A pair of gardeners, who have long since stopped flinching at such noises, carry on trimming the hedge. Inside the house, in a converted billiard room now filled with workbenches, lathes, and drawing boards, a small team of engineers makes a note in a logbook and moves on to the next test. This is Station 9. One of the most unusual weapons laboratories of the Second World War, and it exists behind the ivy-covered walls of a country house because Britain, in the desperate months after Dunkirk, needed a kind of warfare that no army manual had ever described, and it needed somewhere quiet, private, and utterly unremarkable in which to invent it. To understand why a manor house became a bomb factory, you have to understand the scale of the problem Britain faced in the summer of 1940. The British Expeditionary Force had been driven off the continent, France had fallen, and for the first time in over a century, Britain stood alone against an enemy that controlled the coastline from Norway to the Spanish border. Conventional military options for striking back were almost non-existent. The Army was rebuilding after losing most of its heavy equipment on the beaches. The RAF was fighting for survival in the skies over southern England, and any hope of retaking Europe by force lay years in the future. Winston Churchill, characteristically impatient with passivity, demanded something more immediate, a means of striking at the German war machine from within, using sabotage, subversion, and the local populations of occupied countries. The organization created to do this, the Special Operations Executive, was given an instruction that has since become famous, to set Europe ablaze. It was a stirring phrase, but it created an entirely practical problem. Ordinary weapons were useless for the work being proposed. A rifle or a grenade could not be smuggled past a checkpoint in a farmer's cart, could not be handed to a teenage member of the Polish underground without arousing suspicion, and could not bring down a railway bridge without an engineer's understanding of stress and structure. Existing demolition charges were bulky, required specialist knowledge to time correctly, and were almost impossible to disguise. A resistance fighter caught carrying military explosive was as good as dead, and so was anyone standing near them. What SOE needed was not more weapons in the conventional sense, but an entirely new category of object. Tools of sabotage that looked, felt, and weighed exactly like the everyday items around them, that could be primed by an amateur in the dark in under a minute, and that would detonate reliably hours or days later without any further human intervention. No factory in Britain had ever been asked to build anything like that, and no existing government department had the freedom, the secrecy, or the peculiar cast of mind required to design it. The problem, in short, appeared to some of the more conventional minds in Whitehall to be nearly impossible, which is precisely why it was handed to a group of engineers who did not think in conventional terms at all, and given a home far from the prying eyes of London. That home was the Frythe, a large Edwardian house near Welwyn Garden City that had previously served as a research station for ICI. Its remoteness, its high walls, its existing laboratories, and its proximity to London by train made it an ideal choice, and in the autumn of 1940 it was requisitioned and renamed Station 9. The man placed in charge, Commander Douglas Newitt, brought together a small band of scientists, engineers, and enthusiastic amateurs, among them Elder Wills, a former film set designer whose skill lay in making objects look convincingly ordinary, and Major Malcolm Burgess, whose background was in industrial chemistry. Their task, set out by SOE's leadership, was to design and manufacture devices that could be issued to resistance movements across occupied Europe, and to do so in conditions of total secrecy, since even a rumor of the work being done there could have compromised agents already in the field. The house itself became an extraordinary hybrid of stately home and industrial workshop. Bedrooms were converted into drawing offices. The old billiard room became a testing bay for small charges, and outbuildings were fitted with lathes, presses, and chemical stores. Staff cycling to the local pub in the evening gave nothing away about the fact that, only hours before, they had been calculating the burn rate of a delayed action fuse. Among the devices to emerge from Station 9 was the limpet mine, a magnetic explosive charge designed to be clamped to the hull of a ship below the waterline. It weighed a little under 5 kilograms, was roughly the size and shape of a large soup tureen, and used a ring of powerful magnets, borrowed in concept from industrial lifting equipment, to hold it firmly against a curved steel hull even in choppy water. Its explosive core was set off not by a simple clock but by a device called a time pencil, a slender copper tube not much larger than a fountain pen, in which a small glass vial of acid was crushed and then allowed to eat slowly through a restraining wire. Once the wire parted, a spring-loaded striker fired into a percussion cap, initiating the charge. Depending on the thickness of the wire and the strength of the acid, agents could select a delay of anywhere between 10 minutes and several days, and because the mechanism relied on chemistry rather than clockwork, it made no ticking sound that a sentry might detect. Elsewhere in the same workshops, engineers built exploding lumps of coal, indistinguishable from the real thing even under close inspection, incendiary devices disguised as tins of preserved fruit, and a folding motorcycle called the well bike, small enough to be dropped by parachute in a cylindrical container and assembled by a single agent in under a minute. Production of the more successful designs, once perfected at the Frythe, was quietly transferred to small engineering firms and workshops around the country, often without the workers there ever being told what the components they were machining would eventually become. Exact production figures remain difficult to establish, since much of the paperwork was destroyed or never centrally recorded, though historians estimate that tens of thousands of limpet mines and time pencils were manufactured before the war's end. The true measure of these devices, however, lies not in the workshop but in the field, and here the record is a mixture of vivid documented triumph and frustrating, deliberate silence. The most celebrated use of the limpet mine came in December 1942, when 10 Royal Marines of the Royal Marine Boom Patrol Detachment paddled canoes nearly 100 kilometers up the Gironde estuary in occupied France to reach the docks at Bordeaux, a raid later remembered as Operation Frankton and immortalized as the story of the cockleshell heroes. Under cover of darkness, the surviving Marines attached limpet mines to the hulls of German merchant vessels, then withdrew into the French countryside, most never to be seen again, captured and executed under Hitler's commando order. The mines they left behind detonated as designed, sinking or seriously damaging several ships and disrupting a port that had been feeding material to German forces. Elsewhere, resistance networks across France, Norway, the Low Countries, and the Balkans received consignments of Station 9 equipment through parachute drops and used time pencils to bring down railway lines ahead of German troop movements, to destroy transformer stations, and to sabotage factory machinery from within. Precise casualty figures and material losses inflicted by these devices are almost never recorded with confidence, since resistance cells operated in secrecy and rarely filed the sort of after-action reports that regular armies produce. But German internal correspondence from occupied territories repeatedly complains of an atmosphere of creeping insecurity among garrison troops, who could never be certain whether a lump of coal on a locomotive tender was fuel or death. If you are finding the story of Station 9 as strange and fascinating as I do, a quick subscribe helps this channel more than you might think. Germany was not without its own sabotage apparatus. The Abwehr, the military intelligence service, and later the SS security service maintained units tasked with infiltration and demolition behind enemy lines, and German engineers were perfectly capable of building disguised charges of their own, including explosive devices hidden inside briefcases and thermos flasks. Where the German effort differed was in scale. consistency, and doctrine. German sabotage work tended to be improvised for specific operations rather than mass-produced as a standardized kit issued to thousands of foreign partisans, and Berlin never built an equivalent of SOE's supply chain into occupied Europe, since Germany was, after all, the occupying power rather than the resistance. Across the Atlantic, the American Office of Strategic Services, established later and initially far smaller than SOE, actively borrowed British designs rather than reinventing them, and time pencils manufactured to Station 9 specifications were shared with American operatives under the code name Aunt Sally, allowing OSS teams in Asia and Europe to draw on technology that British engineers had already tested and refined. The comparison, then, is less a story of rival inventors racing each other and more one of a single British innovation being adopted, with gratitude, by an ally still building its own irregular warfare capability from scratch. Where the Germans built weapons for an occupying army seeking to hold ground, and the Americans were, for a time, students of the British method, Station 9 had the peculiar advantage of designing specifically for the underdog, for the amateur saboteur with no formal training and only minutes to act. Assessing the overall impact of Station 9's work honestly requires some caution, because the psychological effect of these weapons is easier to describe than their precise material toll. Individual acts of sabotage rarely altered the course of a battle, and historians are careful not to claim that limpet mines or exploding coal won the war on their own. What they did achieve, consistently and measurably, was the diversion of German manpower and resources into guarding infrastructure that would otherwise have gone to the front, and the slow corrosion of confidence among occupation troops who could never fully trust the objects around them. That climate of suspicion, multiplied across thousands of railway yards, docks, and factories throughout occupied Europe, represents a form of damage that does not show up neatly in a casualty count, but which German commanders themselves acknowledged as a genuine drain on morale and resources. The technical lessons learned at the Frythe also outlasted the war itself, feeding directly into post-war special forces equipment and into the culture, still visible today, of military engineers designing weapons around concealment and improvisation rather than brute force alone. Surviving examples of the devices built there, including limpet mines, time pencils, and the little folding well bike, can now be seen in the collections of the Imperial War Museum in London and in smaller specialist museums devoted to the Special Operations Executive, quiet metal objects behind glass that give almost no hint of the ingenuity or the danger that went into their making. Return for a moment to that lawn outside the Frythe, to the lump of coal that was never coal, and to the quiet click of a time pencil doing its patient chemical work in the dark. It is easy, looking back from a comfortable distance, to imagine the Second World War as a story told entirely in tanks, aircraft, and grand strategy, decided in the great set-piece battles that fill the history books. But behind a screen of beech trees in Hertfordshire, in bedrooms turned into drawing offices and a billiard room turned into a bomb range, a small and eccentric team of engineers built a different kind of war altogether, one fought with disguise rather than firepower, with patience rather than mass, with a lump of coal that could bring down a locomotive and a soup tin that could sink a ship. They asked an impossible question. How do you arm an untrained farmer, a teenage courier, a school teacher with no military background whatsoever, and still expect them to strike a blow against the most powerful army in Europe? And they answered it not with bigger weapons but with smaller, cleverer, better hidden ones. The house itself gave nothing away. Then or for decades afterwards, its gardens tended, its corridors quiet, its true purpose locked in classified files while the objects it produced did their work in the shadows of occupied Europe. That, in the end, is the real achievement of Station 9. Not a single dramatic invention, but an entire philosophy of secret warfare, built behind the walls of an English manor house that taught the Allies how to fight a war the enemy could never quite see coming.